By the time he was 9 years old, young John Bosco could be seen putting on his own shows. Tightrope walking, juggling, sleight of hand, and puppetry attracted many boys, sometimes 100 at a time, watching. The price of admission to these shows? Let us say Our Lady's Rosary, said the young showman. His audience knelt and gladly obeyed. Today we'll hear about a singular event that occurred in his boyhood when John challenged some traveling charlatans who were interfering with church services to match their prowess against his. The Miracles and Prophecies of St. John Bosco, a project of America Needs Fatima. I'm your host, Matthew Miller. Subscribe for new episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. In 1825, as a mere boy of 10, he started on a small scale what later he would call a festive oratory, doing what was in keeping with his age and his knowledge. He followed these lines for several years, his talks becoming ever more fruitful as his knowledge of religion increased. For this purpose, he diligently gathered edifying stories from catechism classes, sermons, and books he had read in order to instill love of virtue in all his listeners. But it wasn't only his stories, tricks, and lovable traits that captured the hearts of so many youngsters. In those early years and throughout his life to his dying day, there must have shone through his whole countenance the purity of his soul. To meet him, to be near him, produced a joy, a peace of mind, a delight, and such an ardent desire to become better that it couldn't be traced to a purely earthly affection. Thousands of boys have experienced this, and it has been confirmed by thousands of others who worked together with him. Once they knew John Bosco, they could no longer detach themselves from him, nor could they ever forget his magnetic personality. But the field of action to which Margaret's son had been destined by Providence was far greater than might have been imagined in the beginning. This was becoming obvious, and proof of it can be seen in various episodes in which it would seem impossible that a mere boy could be so certain of himself. The following incidents will serve to strengthen this point. When John was about 12, a dance was held on a certain holy day at the public square of Morialdo. When it was time for the afternoon church services, John entered the square and began to move about the crowd, among whom he saw many persons he knew. He tried to persuade them to bring the dance to an end and go instead to church for vespers. "Look at this child, still wet behind the ears, trying to tell us what to do," someone remarked. "Who sent you on this nice little errand to act as our preacher or spiritual director?" asked another. "Just like you to butt into our business and bother us when we're enjoying ourselves," added a third. "Mind your own business and don't put your nose where it doesn't belong," rudely sneered a fourth. And they all laughed in his face. John then began to sing a popular religious hymn in so beautiful and harmonious a voice that little by little they all gathered around him. A few moments later he moved toward the church, and the others, drawn by his voice, followed him in. Toward nightfall, he returned to the scene of the dancing that had been resumed with wild frenzy. It was getting dark now, and John remarked to those who seemed more sensible than the rest, "It's time to go home. This is no time for dancing." No one listened to him, so he began to sing again as he had done before. At the sweet, magic-like sound of his voice, the dancing ceased, and the dance floor was soon vacant. Everyone gathered around him, and when he had finished his song, several offered him gifts to resume his singing. He refused the gifts, but went on singing nonetheless. The organizers of the dance, who saw their profits vanishing into thin air, took him aside and offered him money, saying, "Look, either you take this money and leave, or else we'll give you a beating you'll never forget." "Now wait just a minute. Do you own this place?" replied John. "You don't scare me. I can do as I please. Some of my relatives are here, and they're expected home. I'm not doing you any wrong in calling them. Their families are afraid that something unpleasant may happen to them, some brawl or harm. Why keep them worrying? I think you're sensible and decent enough to agree that at this time of night something may get out of hand that you'll be sorry for later. If I'm so worried about this, it's because our village has always had a good name. Am I showing you disrespect in asking for this? Such arguments, advanced by a young boy, were amazing. Many stopped dancing and went home. Others, more eager, stayed on a few more minutes, but being so few, they too decided to call it a night. Another time, in the evening, a sermon was to be delivered in the chapel of a hamlet not far from Becky. The chapel was only partially filled, while the square in front of it was crowded with men whose murmur reached the worshippers inside. Suddenly, the blare of a trumpet shook the square. The boys leaped up from their pews and raced for the church door. Nobody could hold them back. The girls followed the boys, and shortly afterward, they were joined also by the women, curious to see what it was about. John also ran out into the square at such a spectacle, and elbowing his way through the crowd, took up his stand in front. All eyes turned to him because he was already well known for his acrobatic feats. With gestures, they pointed at the charlatan, as though to tell him that he had a competitor. John had not left the church out of curiosity, but to carry out a plan of his own. He moved to the center of the open square and challenged the charlatan to compete with him in games of skill. The charlatan mockingly looked over John from head to foot, but the crowd's applause at John's proposal made him realize he would damage his own reputation if he were to refuse the challenge. Shouts arose on all sides. "Bravo! Good! Show what you can do!" By general agreement, a certain feat was chosen for the test. "I agree," John said. "And now let's talk about the terms. This is what I propose. If you win, I'll give you a scudo. If I win, you are to leave this village immediately and never set foot here again during church services." Everyone, eager for the contest, shouted approval. "I accept," answered the charlatan confidently. As things turned out, John won the contest, and the charlatan had to gather his equipment and leave as agreed. Then John turned to the crowd and announced, "Now back to church," and he led them into the house of God. On another occasion, a stranger was talking to a group of men and boys, telling off-color jokes, and occasionally uttering words that bordered on blasphemy. This scandalous conversation distressed John, but he didn't know what to do, since he realized that nothing would silence the man or the raucous laughter of his listeners. 2 trees stood nearby, a little distance apart from each other. He took a rope and knotted one end. Then he flung first one and then the other end over a branch of each of the trees, and drew the rope tight. He performed this feat in the twinkling of an eye. The crowd, noticing him, abandoned the stranger and gathered around John. He then swung himself upright and began to walk back and forth, as though he had a wide path beneath his feet. The show lasted until dark, when the crowd dispersed and went home. Thus, as a boy, John first carried out his mission with the means that divine providence had given him. The book of Proverbs tells us that God's omnipotence is constantly at play in the universe through his creative and conserving power, and that he delights in being with the children of men. God began, so to speak, to exhibit John before the world as the instrument that he wanted to use for his glory. Thank you all so much for watching, and if you'd like to see a playlist with all of the stories we've done so far about St. John Bosco's youth, just click on the link above me here. God bless you, and Our Lady keep you.